Muzak isn't quite the punchline it used to be in the 90s. We're far enough removed now from its original context and living in an era of on-demand music where we have access to virtually every composition ever at our fingertips. And as a result, Muzak has taken on a different meaning and a different charge. To my ear, it now sounds quaint, playful, and at times even faintly seductive. It's a sound I associate with mid-century modern design and architecture, with retrofuturism, and with TV shows like Mad Men and Twin Peaks that have a very strong aesthetic sense. This shift has a lot to do as well with how the word Muzak itself has been rebranded and reinterpreted. Today, it's often used as a catch-all for music that has perhaps a vintage feel and is atmospheric, for genres like bossa nova and exotica, both of which have a deep history on their own and are anything but disposable, dispensable background music. Look up Muzak playlists on Spotify today, and you'll find them filled with artists like Piero Umiliani and Dorothy Ashby, along with film score legends like Henry Mancini. But this reinterpretation flattens an important distinction and highlights a common present-day misunderstanding, which is that Muzak, or elevator music, or programmed music, refer to styles of music. Something smooth, something, again, mood-setting. Or, if you prescribe to an older understanding of what it is, something bland and forgettable. But Muzak was never intended to be a musical category at all. It was a story of technological innovation, cultural evolution, of business survivalism, and most of all, Muzak was infrastructure. In the 1920s, a military attaché by the name of General George Squire discovered a way to transmit information via electrical wires and thought it would be a great way to distribute music at a time when the only mode of music transmission was AM radio. Sending signal via wire as opposed to through airwaves would offer improved sound quality and fidelity, as well as eliminate the usual disruptions of AM radio, like broadcasters, commercials, news segments, etc. General Squire sold his patents to the North American Radio Company, which used its existing utility infrastructure to offer wired music transmission as an in-home subscription service. They called the service Muzak. They ran into two issues. Issue number one was music licensing. In order to avoid paying high royalty fees for master recordings, Muzak needed to create their own recorded catalog, and throughout the 1930s, they developed a library of 7,500 recordings, which included movie scores, operas, Cuban, Hawaiian, classical, ragtime music, and featured artists like Jimmy Dorsey and Rosemary Clooney. Issue number two was competing with radio. Despite its efforts in successfully navigating the licensing angle, the company struggled to sell enough subscriptions to remain profitable. Despite AM radio's shortcomings, expensive equipment, and the poor sound quality and fidelity mentioned earlier, radio ruled the residential market. It was only when Muzak was pushed into factories during the height of World War II that the company finally found its footing and achieved sustained success. The timing of this was no accident. For decades, the industrial economy had been moving toward greater scale and tighter control. But when the Depression hit, factory worker morale understandably sank. Strikes increased and output slowed. By the time the war came and pushed production demands even higher than usual, labor unrest became something that couldn't be ignored. Factory owners needed solutions that could boost productivity without provoking further resistance. Or in other words, ways to encourage labor while appearing to accommodate workers. In response to this problem, industries turned to a wave of workforce studies called the Hawthorne studies that had been conducted in the 1920s and 1930s. The Hawthorne studies examined how specific factors shaped productivity. They looked at both physical conditions, like improved lighting, as well as social conditions like worker attention spans and collaboration. The study suggested that more inviting and hospitable environments communicated care and intention, which improved worker morale and, therefore, boosted productivity. Muzak saw an opportunity to align itself with these ideas. The company argued that soft, carefully curated, and intentionally unengaging background music could improve worker mood without interrupting efficiency. They eliminated loud brasses and vocals from their music, focusing instead on strings and woodwinds that would blend with the surroundings. The thought was, if sound can influence mood, and mood influences output, then sound can be optimized as a means of enhancing productivity. During the war, this logic also adopted a patriotic angle, with factory sound systems not only delivering instrumentals, but also broadcasting patriotic marches by the likes of John Philip Sousa, as well as inspiring messages from figures like Roosevelt and Churchill. Sousa himself actually despised these technologies and the radio generally, calling it canned music and arguing that it shrank the grand power of his marches, which in his defense is completely understandable. But industry wasn't concerned with grandeur. Music had now officially shifted from atmosphere to optimization and from background music into what it now termed functional music. And there was evidence to back it too, with studies finding that functional music reduced absenteeism in the workforce by 88%, reduced worker resentment when completing repetitive tasks, and allowed for a response time 0.27 seconds faster than that of workers exposed to nothing but the white noise of a small fan. It was here, under the banner of functional music, that Muzak introduced perhaps its most notorious idea: stimulus progression. Stimulus progression is the concept of changing the styles and tempos of music to counterbalance and influence the natural rhythms of the human body. For instance, during times of the day that worker productivity consistently dipped, such as before and after lunch, the curated playlists would provide more upbeat music with the goal of boosting worker energy and output. And optimizing the factory floor was only the beginning. If sound could regulate the behavior of thousands of workers under the pressure of wartime production, the question wasn't whether it could work elsewhere. It was simply a matter of where to try next. The post-war American economy was beginning to deindustrialize, and the American consumer was becoming more educated and affluent than ever. That, along with the creation of the two-career family, gave rise to the service sector. Muzak did what it did best. It adapted and it followed the money into retail spaces, restaurants, hotels, and the like. On July 28, 1945, an Army B-52 bomber crashed into the 79th story of the Empire State Building. Flames quickly spread up the elevator shaft, damaging cables on the way and threatening to engulf 50 people stuck inside of a glass observatory. The front page article in the next day's New York Times reported, "Even at this terrifying juncture, however, the canned music that is wired into the observatory continued to play, and the soothing sounds of a waltz helped the spectators there to control themselves. In the post-war period, background music had become an absolute cultural staple, with Muzak very much leading the charge. By the 1950s, the company had become the biggest consumer of phone lines in the world. As its popularity grew, Muzak established 4 individual networks, each intended to service a different business type and need. The Purple Network served restaurants. The Red Network offered news, sports, and weather reports and was intended primarily for bars and grills. The Blue Network served department stores, and the Green Network re-established Muzak's early commitment to providing private in-home services. Since each network offered music specifically tailored to its environment, it became known as programmed music. In this new service economy, the role of background music was no longer to encourage factory workers to produce, but baby boomers to consume. It's important to clarify, though, that the introduction of background music into the service sector was as much intention as it was inertia. Background music had become so ubiquitous at this point that most people expected it to follow them around at home, at the office, in public transportation, much as we do now. And Muzak was happy to oblige. Having already positioned itself and succeeded as functional music with statements like, "Music is art, Muzak is science," Muzak wanted to maintain its industrial logic even in this new economy. It realized that in the retail sphere, background music did not need to stay anonymous or to force alertness without causing distraction as it did in the factories. Instead, it needed to come to the foreground, set a mood, and enhance customer experience. Vocals and percussion, long stripped from Muzak arrangements, were reintroduced, and easy listening covers of popular songs began to fill Muzak catalogs. Stimulus progression was eventually replaced with quantum modulation, which organized music based on criteria such as rhythm, genre, and popularity, and sought to create a consistent atmosphere rather than intervene in the natural rhythms of the body. Outside research eventually caught up and began to look into the use of music within the service sector. Ronald Millman's 1982 and 1986 studies are considered to be the seminal works here. He found that music with a slower tempo slowed down traffic in both retail spaces and restaurants, leading customers to linger and to spend more. Further studies show that slower music also caused customers to underestimate how much time had passed, while unfamiliar music did the opposite. Since the goal was to keep people in the room longer, especially in retail, slow and familiar was just the ticket, which is why easy listening, including those easy listening covers of popular songs, solidified itself as the soundtrack of many businesses. But, of course, to every rule, there is an exception. In Joseph Lanza's Elevator Music, a surreal history of Muzak, easy listening, and other mood song, he shares an anecdote about a brothel in Stuttgart, which found that their Muzak program was preventing a profitable turnover because it wasn't getting clients in and out fast enough. Inversely, in 1992, the LA Times reported that 7-Eleven chains were installing Muzak in their stores to drive away loitering teenagers. Apparently, this was so effective that similar Muzak attacks were planned all over LA County. But whether the goal was for customers to stay or go, the true consumer of programmed music at that point was no longer the customer, but the business itself. To quote Jonathan Stern from his paper, Sounds Like the Mall of America, Programmed Music and the Architectonics of Commercial Space, the use of programmed music in a shopping mall is about the production and consumption of consumption. Stern argues that retailers are purchasing the music so as to consume listeners' response to it. And with that, music had moved from art to utility to commodity, and from the background into the banal. Despite Muzak's vast success, the company was starting to amass criticism and public distaste as early as the 1960s. The post-war period was, of course, largely marked by its counterculture movement. People, especially young people in the 60s, were broadly suspicious of institutions and critical of mass persuasion. It was evident to many of them that the mass propaganda of the war apparatus hadn't disappeared. Instead, it had redirected its attention to propagating mass culture and mass marketing. Naturally, people saw the status quo market order and business practices, including Muzak, as attempts at control. Through the 1950s and even into the 60s, business management was still in big part defined by Taylorism. Taylorism is a philosophy of structural management built around the belief that human behavior is measurable and optimizable for efficiency, and that the worker is a means to a production end. Having awakened to the oppressive nature of the workplace, American society in the post-war period was desperate for more humanism and less, functional music. In Conquest of Cool, Thomas Frank explains that by the middle of the 1950s, discussions of conformity, of consumerism, and of the banality of mass-produced culture were routine elements of middle-class American life. According to Frank, the standard story of the time, and even decades later, is that business was the monolithic bad guy who had caused America to become a place of puritanical conformity and empty consumerism. That business was the great symbolic foil against which the young rebels defined themselves. But he also argues that it's wrong to look at things from just that narrow angle. As it turns out, Frank continues, many American businesses imagine the counterculture not as an enemy to be undermined or as a threat to consumer culture, but as a hopeful sign, a symbolic ally of their own struggles against the mountains of deadweight procedure and hierarchy that had accumulated over the years. Some business leaders valued humanism, creativity, and a rebellious spirit just as the countercultural youth did. One such entrepreneur was Seattle-based Mark Torrance. Taking note of the public's declining perception of Muzak, he founded Yesco Incorporated in 1968 as a counter to Muzak's dominance. What he offered to retailers were licenses to original soft rock radio hits, and he managed to build a loyal client base among restaurants, department and fashion stores, and hotels that wanted music with more individuality and presence. With this, Yesco pushed music in the service sector truly to the foreground. According to Joseph Lanza, the enthusiasm for foregrounding music in the 1980s confirmed that with the service and leisure industries becoming indistinguishable, any kind of music could be put to Muzak purposes with similar results. Yesco proved itself to be a formidable component because of its ability to appeal to the changing tides of popular opinion, and it turned into Muzak's biggest competitor to date. But Muzak refused to fade out. It had reinvented itself before, and it would do so again. Muzak began to work closely with Yesco, and by the mid-1980s, the two companies had merged, with Mark Torrance himself installed as the company's president. Coincidentally, the merger brought Muzak's headquarters to Torrance's hometown of Seattle, and the company soon found itself sharing turf with the grunge movement of the 1990s. The countercultural movement of the 90s closely resembled that of the 60s in that it too was a response to mass persuasion. As we said, in the 1960s, society and business practices transitioned away from soullessness and banality and into creativity and individuality. From a marketing standpoint, basically the plot of Mad Men. The 60s were the birth of market segmentation, the process of tailoring marketing to specific demographics based on age, gender, income status, and the like. But over 30 years, this individualized marketing became so co-opted and commodified that it also began to read as manipulation. Young people in the 90s were acutely aware that their identities had become raw material for companies who were trying to peddle products to them. Their subcultures and aesthetics were being mined and sold back to them. Even personal computing, which initially promised to be anti-corporate and built around the premise of putting power in your hands and serving your purposes, seemed to develop its commercial infrastructure much faster than it did its democratic one. What people craved as a result was authenticity, and they found it in the truly anti-corporate and anti-scale, in the unpolished, in indie film, and in grunge music. But, of course, it was only a matter of time until authenticity landed in the mouth of every Madison Avenue ad exec. The digital age significantly shortened the time it took for subcultures to be discovered, packaged, and redistributed. However, here too we must remember Thomas Frank. In his essay titled Why Johnny Can't Descend, Frank reminds us that cultural and market ideas travel in tandem. He says, the cultural idea has become capitalist orthodoxy. Its hunger for transgression now perfectly suited to an economic cultural regime that runs on ever faster cyclings of the new. Its taste for self-fulfillment and its intolerance for the confines of tradition now permitting vast latitude in consuming practices and lifestyle experimentation. In 1993, Gap launched their Kerouac wore khakis advertising campaign. In 1994, Nike enlisted their own beat author, William S. Burroughs, to sell Air Maxes. In response to the Nike ad, Leslie Savan of The Village Voice wrote that the realization that nothing threatens the corporate system has freed advertising to exploit even the most marginal elements of society. In this case, the troubled figure that is Burroughs. In fact, she says, being hip is no longer quite enough. Better the pitchman be underground. She argues that the real problem with the co-opting of culture comes in how easily any idea, deed, or image can become part of the sponsored world. I always think of the film The Matrix as the perfect example of this. The Matrix was revolutionary in popular culture for its critique of manufactured reality and the pacification of the masses, but it too ultimately became a massive movie franchise with its own line of merchandise. The culture industry managed to co-opt a direct criticism of itself. The film was the victim or perhaps a symptom of its own diagnosis. In an attempt to provide their own co-opted authenticity, Muzak launched their audio architect program in the 90s. They hired 18 Gen X hipsters, including, ironically enough, founders of the indie label Sub Pop Records and members of Seattle grunge bands Tad and Mudhoney. Audio architects researched sources like Billboard magazine and MTV and chose songs that would be re-recorded instrumentally for the few background channels that music still carried. They also prepped Muzak's foreground catalog of original format songs for quantum modulation by rating the songs on 45 detailed categories, including mood, instrumentation, color, and the gender of the vocalist. Once categorized, the songs will be assembled into 60 broadcast channels. In keeping up with personalization, Muzak reps met with prospective clients to create an audio image and select the channel that would best suit their business and branding needs. When authenticity had become sufficiently commodified and the lure of brand identity faded in the early 2000s, the internet helped us to return to what we thought was word-of-mouth endorsement. We perceived bloggers and early internet personalities to be relatable and independent purveyors of culture and taste. And again, for a time, some were. But even in the 90s, businesses were beginning to understand the value of buzz around a product or trend. A 1998 Newsweek article claimed that buzz greases the great conveyor belt of culture and commerce, moving everything from movies to fashions faster and faster. Even before modern social medias like Instagram or even MySpace existed, market seeding programs like Buzz Agent were sending free products to influential customers to generate recommendations that appeared organic. And even truly independent voices were quickly identified by brands and offered compensation for their co-opted endorsements. It wasn't until 2009 that the FTC finally required disclosure of agreements between advertisers and endorsers. So until then, consumers had no way of knowing where a genuine independent recommendation ended and an advertisement began. But in the world of music specifically, the internet's early promise did hold on a little longer. With the invention of Napster, LimeWire, and iTunes, the personal library became vast, portable, and more accessible. For the first time, music discovery had no institutional intermediary, no radio DJ, no audio architect. You could find anything, own it, and play it, in your living room or in your bar. This put Muzak at odds with the small and mid-sized business clients that had afforded the company its success. After all, Muzak's franchise model had been designed to reach smaller businesses like restaurants, barbershops, small hotels, and independent retailers. But even though hooking up your iPod and airing your playlists into your shop was and is copyright infringement, it was also free, and copyright law was very difficult to enforce. So most small business owners took the risk. And for a brief accidental moment that spanned the better part of the early 2000s, the music playing in many commercial spaces was genuinely individual. It was the preference of the owners or of the employees. Their taste may not have been refined or optimized for a specific demographic, but it did have a point of view. What made this moment brief, of course, was the birth of the algorithm. Pandora launched in 2005 and gained popularity over the following years as a form of assisted listening. You would enter in a song or artist, and the algorithm would build you a radio station of similar tracks. Spotify then launched in Europe in 2008, in the US in 2011, and made its own algorithmic radio station offering in 2012. Initially, it was considerably weaker than Pandora's, but improved considerably over the following years. In 2015, Spotify launched Discover Weekly. In 2016, the Release Radar and Daily Mix. In 2023, AI DJ made its debut and introduced AI-powered music curation. And last year, in 2025, they expanded their AI tools by integrating ChatGPT for playlist recommendations and improved personalization. Like all other attention economy business models, Spotify prioritizes retention and in recent years has tuned its algorithm toward familiarity and repetition at the expense of novelty and discovery. Musicians, meanwhile, are forced to appease the social media algorithm to get noticed and are choosing to produce hooky tracks in the hopes of reaching virality. And it is this algorithmic vortex that is now providing the soundtracks of our nights out and increasingly of our lives. I remember a moment freshly post-pandemic when every moderately hip bar or restaurant would go 5 rounds of Krungbin in a span of 2 hours. And that trend has only continued. It's gotten to a point where just by soaking in the atmosphere of a commercial space, you can anticipate the artists you'll hear. Earthy but cool, Erykah Badu. Youthful yet upscale, L'Imperatrice. Low, lit and self-conscious, Men I Trust. We no longer need music's quantum modulation because we've got it in our pockets. So where did this leave Muzak? Having been squeezed from below by iTunes and streaming, the company filed for bankruptcy in 2009 and was acquired by Mood Media in 2011. Mood Media is an audiovisual and tech company which provides music, digital signage, AV systems, and even scent marketing to companies worldwide. Its clients include Ace Hardware, Caribou Coffee, The North Face, Primark, huge companies with hundreds or thousands of locations. Mood Media serves these big-name brands because unlike your neighborhood dive, they can afford the service, sure, but they also need it. For them, the legal exposure and resulting lawsuit fees for playing unlicensed music across 1,000 locations are just not worth the risk. But even more, these companies' customers expect a consistency and continuity of service, which Mood Media can deliver. Mood Media serves as a legal one-stop shop for all these companies' atmospheric needs, meaning that for you as a consumer, a North Face in Denver will look, smell, and sound roughly the same as a North Face in Hangzhou. And for me, this whole story raises the question, do all roads lead to commodification? Joseph Pine and James Gilmore argue that market economies have evolved from industrial to service and to then experience economies on the basis that over time, goods and services naturally become commoditized and push clients to demand greater customization. It's hard to know who's responsible. Are businesses racing to the bottom and eroding differentiation until everything starts to feel the same? Or are we as consumers incapable of remaining satisfied, forever acclimating to the new normal and reaching for whatever improved customization comes next? Or perhaps do we want to be commodified, at least part of the time? A managed atmosphere feels safe. A familiar playlist is comforting. Everyone rewatched The Office during COVID. Muzak in the elevator kept the spectators calm during that 1945 plane crash. And of course, all of the above can be true. What matters is whether we notice and whether we care. We are allowed to be lulled by the familiar, but we should also expect more when we want to be engaged. We should resist completely losing music to the cycle of commodification that has taken hold of it for the past 100 years. We should have spaces where music is allowed to breathe and to inform a feeling as opposed to simply turn a profit. In my perfect world, a boutique hotel or a local restaurant would sound exactly like itself. Its soundtrack would be an extension of its architecture, its materials, of its history, and its people, curated by someone who understands that the right music could make a space truly transformational and become a part of someone's personal mythology. Thank you for sitting with me, and until next time.